Welcome, everybody, to yet another episode of The Professor and the Idiot. Coming in on episode 40, maybe, or close. I'm Nick Wolfinger.
I'm Amy Newberg. I'm the idiot.
We'll withhold our judgment on that.
Always honing the idiot persona. Or not.
And today, I'm very happy to introduce a guest I should have had a long time ago. W. Bradford Wilcox is a sociologist at the University of Virginia. He is the director of the National Marriage Project and a senior fellow and the director of the Institute for Family Studies at the University of Virginia, and also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where they have a spectacular lunch buffet. Brad is also... Brad is also my long-term collaborator. He and I have collaborated on several articles, and 4 years ago, a book called Soulmates, Religion, Sex, Love, and Marriage Among African Americans and Latinos.
It's in my bathroom.
At least you've looked at it.
Among many other classics, yes.
So one of the features of the book that has got some attention that I always appreciate is best reflected by a sentence that appears in our introduction, which reads something like this: Wilcox is a conservative, practicing Catholic, a father of a large multiracial family. Wolfinger is none of these things. And so we attempted to tout our authorship team on the basis of how bipartisan it was. And so I think that's one thing that's always made our collaboration especially rewarding to me, and hopefully should make this interview the same. And if you go buy our book, Brad and I each get $2. So, Brad is here.
Can I ask a background question of Brad? What is the marriage? I've forgotten what it's called already. Marriage project?
So yeah, there's a national marriage project at the University of Virginia that I direct, and we're trying to figure out really kind of what's happening to marriage in America, how it affects kids, and also think about ways from both a kind of a policy perspective and from a cultural perspective to strengthen the institution. So those are some of the things that the project works on. I mean, we also have, visiting lecturers coming to UVA. We had Nick Wolfinger to UVA, I think it was in 2019. So, these are the kinds of things that we do in part with the project.
I came out to UVA last year. The two of us have also participated in many conferences talking about marriage, some of which you organized, others were organized by other people. To me, the starting point is always the huge social class divide in marriage today in America, where if you have a four-year college degree, you're likely to get married, you're likely to stay married, whereas people without college degrees are much less likely to get married and more likely to have children out of wedlock.
And what is the cause and effect here?
Yes.
If you get a college degree, are you then more likely to get married, or is it just that people who don't go to college tend not to get married?
So that's a great question. It's partly what we call a selection effect in social science. That is, the kinds of people who have the financial resources, get into college and graduate from college, are the same kinds of people who are more likely to find a partner, marry that person, and go the distance. So that's, I think, part of the story. But I think, too, just the advantages that college in and of itself confers upon people in terms of, again, social networks, jobs, income are also kind of causally linked to doing better in today's family world as well.
You also learned in college some problem-solving skills, some communicating skills, and persistence. You have to show you can stay with something for 4 or 5 years.
Right, and it gives you a better chance at advancement in life in other ways, which probably affects your stability.
That's right. I think that all those points are are right on the money. But it's important to note too. I mean, Nick, you mentioned kind of what I'm working on right now. One of the things that I'm doing right now is to be working on a book tentatively called "We Before Me" on contemporary marriage. And one of the things that I do in the book is to sort of look at what are the sort of social and cultural factors that predict getting married and staying married in America today. And a college degree was one of those things. We talk about why that's the case, but also found that being religious was a major predictor of all these things in terms of these marriage outcomes. And then also Asian Americans too were more likely to be married and to be stably married as well. And so when you kind of throw these factors in a multivariate regression model like Nick does all the time, what you see is that both college attendance and religious attendance and having an Asian American background independently predict being married in America today and being stably married as well.
So when you say religious attendance, that's irrespective of the denomination. It just depends upon whether you go regularly.
That's how I looked at it in this particular project. And it's like we did before, Nick.
Yes.
It's interesting that, you come at it from a social scientist perspective where what you look at are easily measurable things. Because I've also heard from psychologists all kinds of other things that keep a marriage together. I mean, do you look at that at all, or is that just not on your radar? Such as certain kinds of communication seem to predict better long-term outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, one of the things that I do in the book is to kind of critique work that John Gottman has done. And he's a great family psychologist, and he kind of articulates in his work basically 5 ideas that he has kind of drawn from watching hundreds of couples over the years, particularly in what was called his Love Lab, which is an apartment overlooking a canal in Seattle. And he would have couples come in there for the weekend, and he would just sort of like watch them with his team, code their interactions, and just kind of figure out what were the traits of successful marriages and unsuccessful ones. And so what he found was that on the positive side of the ledger, sort of trading about 5 positive interactions at a minimum for every 1 interaction, things like being affectionate or offering some kind of praise or Thanksgiving or, doing something, in that way was a predictor of, marital stability. And by contrast, doing things like being defensive or being critical or not being responsive to criticism. And he has like this phrase, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Of these 4 different things that he refers to are sort of warning signs. And so anyways, you kind of can take his perspective and understand that it's really important to sort of communicate in certain ways to avoid certain kinds of attacks on your partner in terms of verbally and things like that.
What's the critique you have?
To be affectionate and responsive. So all that's true, but the point that I make in the book is that his psychological approach doesn't explain why. It doesn't explain why the neighborhood just to the west of where he did all this research has about 90% of the parents. A couple miles to the south and east of his has only religion, your racial
Can I stop you for a second?
Your social networks. So my book is trying to kind of highlight those things, but then beyond that, I said there are 5 key things to a strong marriage today, and those 5 key things are: 1, a sense of communion, a kind of we before me. So the couple has a strong sense that they are a couple and that their sort of identity together in some ways means more than their individual identity. So practical example of that would be, for instance, having a joint checking account rather than 2 separate accounts. That would be an example of kind of we before me, this kind of communion. The second thing that I talk about is sort of the importance of sort of seeing kids. This is the second C, children, as sort of a primary concern of your marriage. The third C is commitment, understood in terms of fidelity and permanency in your marriage. The fourth C is cash, recognizing that money plays an important role in a successful marriage, and having a steady stream of money is important for a marriage to succeed in most cases. And the final C is community, and that's the people who are embedded in communities, often religious, but not always, that kind of honor and support their marriage, their family life, are more likely to be flourishing. So anyways, that's my point, is that beyond just sort of the techniques that someone like John Gottman articulates in terms of how best to conduct your marriage, it's helpful to have a certain set of financial, cultural, and communal factors in your corner as well.
Well, I am so against having joint bank accounts, but that's a whole nother story.
We can talk about that.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
well, okay. So parenthetically, let me note that my internet took about a 20-second dump. So the answer to your question about, you were starting to say, Brad, about the people who are in the area right next to John Gottman's Love Lab.
Yeah, so right. So when you look at Seattle, if you look at the neighborhood that's just to the west of John Gottman's Love Lab, you see an incredibly high degree of family stability. The vast majority of kids are being raised in two-parent families. And then if you travel south, just a couple of miles south and east along the lake there, you see a neighborhood where there's a lot of family instability. And most kids are not living in a two-parent married family. So, the point that I make, there is that it's not like it's just about kind of differences in communication styles that explain, why we see these dramatic differences in family stability from one neighborhood in Seattle to the next a few miles away. And it's at that point that I talk about some, important sociological factors that also obviously condition the stability of family life in the U.S.
I would certainly second that the theory is reductive if you expect it to explain all differences in marital stability. Let me go back to something you said about children. How do you reconcile that with the fact that couples with children are less happy and that children don't seem to have much impact on divorce rates?
That's a great question. So yeah, the point I mentioned actually in the book is that it's actually couples who really kind of explicitly see their marriage in terms of as an institution that kind of is important for their kids, who are more likely to be happily married and stably married. But I haven't yet done any analysis to kind of sort of condition whether the story varies by class or race. So that's a good question.
Right. So you could possibly apply some of the same questions to your list as to John Gottman's list.
Correct.
Not to challenge what you're about to write an entire book about, but
no, that's a fair point. And I think it's certainly the case that and one thing that I will be looking at is sort of how these things vary by by ethnicity and religion and education, because of the fact that I think so. For instance, I think that religious couples tend to be more likely to think that marriage is sort of normatively important for child rearing. And so that's sort of part of the argument, sort of more of a religious argument in some ways. Whereas I think that college-educated Americans are either explicitly or implicitly more attentive to the way in which marriage functions today as an economic institution. So those kinds of nuances will be in the book as well.
I discern some dissensus about joint versus separate checking accounts.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't know if I want to get into it. I think it's a great idea to keep them separate. I mean, there are other ways that you can combine things financially in such a way that it's clear you're both committed, such as buying a house together. But unless there's a real disparity in income, in which case it makes sense to have a joint bank account that everybody can access. It just seems like so much friction can be avoided if I buy my shit and you buy your shit. And you keep track of when you buy each other shit in some kind of loose way. This is what I did with my husband of 20 years. And though we are no longer together, we never argued about money. Everything was just sort of, easy. And even when we had a divorce, all we really had to think about was the house, because the objects and the money were already divided.
Yeah, well, I mean, I
So,
think,
but we had an unusual ideal situation in which there was not a disparity in our individual income.
I think Brad will, I'll
yeah, but I
answer you,
mean,
Brad. Yeah.
I don't mean to be too pointed here, but I guess I'm just, the point I would make is that couples who really see their are the most likely not just to be stably married, but to be happily married. And I think that's because they see themselves as a team working together, and they're willing to sacrifice for one another and for their, and for their marriage. Whereas
Yeah, it makes
couples
sense.
who are kind of keeping it, some of themselves back, financially or otherwise. And of course, I'm not saying that any couple, is completely a team, but it's, if you're kind of trying to be deliberate about making your marriage a team, I think you're more likely to succeed at this
Wow.
endeavor.
So maybe we screwed up. Maybe we should have had a joint bank account. We'd still be married now.
Well,
and of course, I mean, and as Nick would say, I mean, it's not that like the joint checking account is the thing, right? It's just that there's a certain kind of perspective.
Right.
So one way that this was explained to me was by my late colleague, Stephen Knock, and he was doing the study of marriage in Louisiana, and he was talking to a couple who lived in Baton Rouge. And as he was talking to them, he discovered that they both much prefer living in New Orleans. They love, the cuisine. They love the cultural vitality, the architecture. And so he's like, why the heck are you living in Baton Rouge? And well, it emerged that they both had family in Baton Rouge, and they just thought it was sort of better for their marriage, for their kin, et cetera, to be in Baton Rouge. So they had sacrificed, kind of their preferred location in service of something, larger than their own kind of individual desires. And of course, this couple was they did quite well in his study. So that's just an example of this kind of playing out in practice.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. So, sociologists looking at marriage and divorce, where do you find the data about that?
So,
rating the success of relationships, how do you find out how successful relationships are?
One thing that I've done, and that Nick's done actually, is look at the General Social Survey, the GSS, which is a national survey conducted every 2 years by the University of Chicago. With federal money, and they interview lots of people in person around the country, and among other things, ask them about how happy they are in their marriage. And we look at kind of what predicts couples report that they're very happy in their marriage. It's kind of a blunt indicator, but it seems to work pretty well. So that's one thing that we look at. But there's also other surveys with much more detailed measures of things like communication, conflict, commitment, and overall satisfaction in marriage. And those measures, put together can be a nice, index that sort of captures the quality of married life for people as well.
The General Social Survey has the great advantage that it's been ongoing every year or every other year since 1972. So it allows us to see how the world and marriage and families have changed over that time.
Does it look at a bunch of people over time, or does it keep changing its population that you're studying?
It's new people.
And what about the fact that the definition of marriage or the definition of committed partnership keeps changing and isn't necessarily defined by marriage? So in Europe, for instance, marriage has become a lot rarer. So if you were only to study people who are actually legally married, you might not get the full story of how well committed relationships do.
Yeah, that's definitely true that, in many places in Europe, and to some extent here in the US, and certainly in Latin America, we see there are many couples who are cohabiting. And so to get sort of the full picture about relationships, in the Americas and in Europe, you really need to think about cohabitation as well. It's also, I think, interesting to note, though, that even in Europe, and certainly in Latin America, marriage is markedly more stable than cohabitation. So even in a country like Norway, for instance, which is obviously pretty secular and progressive and has been so for many decades, you would still see that couples who marry and have kids in Norway are more likely to stay together than couples who cohabit in Norway. And from my perspective, there's a way in which, even for a very secular progressive person, the ceremony, the public signal sent by marriage, the fact that it is still, I think, implicitly seen as kind of a gold standard for, for relationships, is all these things kind of cluster together to help explain why marriage is a more stable thing than is cohabitation.
I would add that in the U.S., they're not comparable at all. Here, most cohabiting relationships tend to be very short. A fair number are preludes to marriage, but if they're not, they tend to be unstable. Now, there is a small percentage of them, cohabiting relationships in this country, that are indistinguishable by marriage. And in a book chapter I wrote this year, that tiny percentage, in the single digits, seems mostly to be composed of academics who say things like, we don't believe in the bourgeois institution of marriage, while they go to great lengths to make sure their cohabiting relationship looks exactly like a bourgeois marriage. So, at least in the US, they're not very comparable. And Brad, I'm sure you know academic couples for whom that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I do find the funny thing that I find when talking to, scholars and policymakers in Washington, for instance, is that they're very keen to talk about stable two-parent, partnerships, and they're reluctant often to talk about marriage. And yet we know that, particularly in the United States, if you're talking about stable families, it's really married families. So there's a kind of a weird reluctance in some quarters to use the M word.
That is weird. I mean, I could understand why some liberals would have that reluctance before marriage equality was the law of the land, but that's no longer an excuse anymore.
That's true.
Yeah, that seems like they could be very much subject to. I'm sure you've probably done this, the public pressure campaign.
Well, I mean, it is what it is, and I think it's many of our elites still have a very kind of ambivalent relationship to marriage, and it's one of the things that I talk about in the book. I think that one of the things too that we see obviously today is that even though elites tend to be more likely to, as you pointed out at the beginning, Nick, to be stably married, when it comes to kind of talking about the merits of marriage in public, there's an often great reluctance or even desire to minimize, the value of marriage. And I think it's for a bunch of reasons, but one of them I think is that, we tend to sort of associate progress with family change, in the last 40, 50 years. And so, many of our well-educated Americans are sort of self-styled progressives in some way or another. And it's part of it. I think it's also the case too that we tend to sort of celebrate, people's choices, whatever those choices might be. And so that sort of celebration of sort of kind of expressive individualism here, like you talked about in your writing, Nick, is also a factor. And then I think there is sort of, a very powerful ethic of sort of toleration that has enveloped certain arenas of life relating to sex and family. Well, of course, we're not tolerant of other kinds of things nowadays, but we won't get into that.
Oh, come on.
So
don't tantalize us with a whiff of scandal or raciness.
So anyways, I'm just saying that, there's this idea that we have to be very tolerant and accepting of, any number of different family choices in America today. And those things, those attitudes are more common among well-educated Americans. So.
You see, I think that's true, in my mind, that never precludes any discussion of marriage.
Well, no, and I would agree. And I think you can even talk about, marriage in a very kind of informational or sort of scientific way with young adults and teens. And we don't do that though. But I think that's because we don't do that because it's people are reluctant, school superintendents are reluctant to talk about or have their teachers in public schools talk about these things. Doctors are reluctant to talk to women who are pregnant about sort of, the merits of of marriage or stable marriage for them and for their kids. So there are all these kind of key elites out there who are, working with parents and working with kids and adolescents who could, even in a very kind of careful, informational way, broach the topic, but they are hesitant to do so for either principled or prudential reasons. And I think, of course, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, we can agree on that.
I just was a slight aside that I just was thinking again about John Gottman and his psychological profile of successful relationships, whether it's his or someone else's. I mean, I heard one recently that I thought actually made a lot of sense, which is that couples who communicate instantly about something that isn't working right, as opposed to not discussing it or waiting a long time and letting it sort of spill over in an unpleasant way, do much better. But it seems to me that it's not an argument against that necessarily to look at another neighborhood and see that people aren't doing as well, because even within that sector of society, those things are probably true. The things that work psychologically for one set of people probably work psychologically for another.
That's a fair point. And so he concretely talks about kind of the way in which criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling are, major problems in relationships. And it's certainly possible too, and it's something that I acknowledge in my book, that those things might be more common in, say, a lower income neighborhood, just in part because, of the stresses that follow from unemployment or from, being unable to pay for your rent or any number of other kinds of sort of structural factors. But it's also the case too that I think, sort of problems in your relationship related to, say, being defensive or being, excessively critical, for instance, can take on greater meaning and become, more likely to be corrosive and to end up in divorce court in contexts where, marriage doesn't have much cultural support or much communal support, right? So, one of the things that Kay Heimowitz has pointed out, for instance, in her writings on Brooklyn, is that she looked at a lot of Chinese immigrants in Brooklyn, and she found that there was tremendous family stability in these immigrant communities. But oftentimes, the marital relationships, wouldn't, from our perspective, be really all that high quality. They might not do well in Gottman's, 5 measures, right, basically. But that wasn't, they had other other fish to fry, and they weren't going to, end the marriage over, a lack of affection or an excessively critical style on the part of one spouse. That's sort of, so that's the kind of point that I'm getting to in part in my book.
It's also interesting to think about why Asian American or Asian families tend to do better, whether that's kind of a societal expectation or some of the other things that we've discussed that they just do better at.
Yeah, I agree. It's an interesting question, but I think if we pursued that now, we'd go far down a rabbit hole.
Right.
But neither Brad and I are Asia specialists.
It sounded like it was an important finding. And
I'm going to sort of say that, the point I would make is that, actually that in terms of the groups in the United States that are most likely to be stably married, if you look at, people's ethnic origins, the work I've been doing indicates it's Indian Americans, and obviously there's a distinctive approach to marriage in India. Of course, it's changing in India as well, but the involvement of kin and arranged marriages and sort of the way in which sort of the family is often seen as a corporate entity, understood, both socially and economically as such, so, but the point I'm making here is that, again, that doesn't mean that, obviously when Indian couples are here in the States, that they're necessarily excelling on the 5 indicators that Gottman mentioned. They have other resources, cultural and communal and economic, that tend to reinforce the stability of their marriages, that are not simply about a certain kind of interaction or communication style.
Let me also invoke the work that you and I produced before your epistemological rupture. That's a joke. Uh, in our book, where we show that Latinos in America have marriage rates and divorce rates that are comparable to those of whites, despite having far less income and education and the other structural factors that we generally associate with successful marriage in this country, which leaves the question if Latinos then actually prospered more and at higher levels of education, they may well have levels of marital stability that were far higher than those of white Americans.
Right. No, that's completely correct, Nick.
And this is because of religion.
Not just in part, but there's a lot of other things. Brad?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, partly that can be true in some cases, but also, there's a kind of familism that, obtained in many, Latin societies as well, too. So that's, I think, part of the story as well.
So we had talked about the family during the pandemic, and certainly we see articles like the one that appeared in the New York Times this week, which suggests that the COVID may be heralding in an age of higher divorce rates, which is probably, I think, mostly a reflection of New York Times writers who are tired of living with each other in 400 square foot apartments and not really grounded in reality.
Well, yeah. So I think that there, all of us are kind of trying to figure out what's happening to family life here in the midst of this pandemic and the recession, and now the protests. And I mean, there's just so much happening in America today. So the question that people like Nick and I are trying to wrestle with is sort of how does this play out for families? And when it comes to marriage, my thinking about this was shaped by the last Great Recession. What we saw then was that during the recession, divorce came down. And then...
Do you mean the Great Depression of the 1930s?
No, the Great Recession, sorry.
Oh, 10 years ago, okay.
Yeah, Great Recession. So divorce came down, in the midst of the Great Recession. And then once things got, better, once the economy began to right itself, there was a kind of pent-up, I think, demand for divorce among couples who had kind of put things off. And so you saw the divorce rate go up a bit, but then it came down again after that. It's come down even more since then. So kind of my perspective was that in the main, I think the financial fallout of the last Great Recession sort of sobered people up about marriage and made them less prone to get divorced. And so my hypothesis with this new crisis we're facing is that existing married couples will be, less likely to get divorced because of the fact that there's so much uncertainty, in terms of medical, financial, other kinds of uncertainties, and that if you're married, it's a kind of form of social support in part, and that you might have a greater appreciation of how much they depend upon their spouse and their kin more generally. So that's my hypothesis, and some colleagues have just done a survey with YouGov, and it certainly is the case that insofar as there is people are being asked about appreciation of their spouse and commitment, that those two trends are sort of going in the direction that I would expect. That is, people are either kind of expressing the idea that appreciation, commitment are pretty much the same even through the pandemic, or they've actually increased, more than they have decreased for the average husband and wife. At the same time, though, there's a decent minority of folks who are not sure their marriage is going to go the distance. It's going to be that they're going to be still together 2 years down the road. So I could be wrong, and still analyzing that data, but I'm kind of wrestling with these two different sort of sets of findings in this new poll.
I would first start by considering the Great Depression in the 1930s as a template where the divorce rate indeed declined significantly as people couldn't afford it. And then probably that contributed to the big spike in divorce right after World War II. So I think the logic of a pent-up reservoir people waiting to divorce makes sense. The one thing I would qualify is about the people who are worried now about their marriage making it. My thing is that probably doesn't have much to do with reality. It's even easy probably to think about that when you've been stuck inside for months in your house with your kids and experiencing unemployment perhaps and all the other things we've come to know from the pandemic. But that I don't know why we should expect that to actually be realized, at least in a year later when we're not, hopefully, sheltering in place. I mean, do you think that's possible? That that's just a reflection of fleeting thinking?
It probably depends on like how bad it is. You
Well, it
know,
always does. Yeah.
and this article that you referred us to, Brad, as Nick said, it was from the perspective of a writer cooped up in a New York apartment, you know, who's got some resources, but he goes out and exposes himself to the disease every day for his job, and she's freaked out about it, and they disagree about how careful to be, and she's taken on more of the responsibilities in the house. She hides away a lot because she's accustomed to having her own space. So there's just a lot of stress going on. And my guess is they'll both be able to look at it and go, okay, this is just happening now and it's all going to be over soon and we'll get through it. But not everybody can. And especially if you're very frightened, you know, if one person really is spending a lot of time out in the world and the other has an immunity issue or something like that, for logistical reasons, I think it would be difficult to stay together. So I'm very curious to know about disagreements in health behavior and how that's affecting relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, I think there are sources of tension. I think, you know, being cooped up together, dealing with sort of medical issues differently, like you were saying, even political disagreements in some cases,
Right.
you know, can make for, sort of can pave the road to divorce. And not to mention sort of just financial stress too, obviously. So my sort of thought was that, yes, all these things are going to be linked in some cases to worse marital quality and to divorce. But offsetting that is just sort of a general sense that when times are tough, you know, we're more likely to look at our friends and family members as potential, you know, sources of support and solidarity. And so that, you know, in the main, the sort of the big effect of all of this trauma would be to sort of encourage people to deepen or develop a new appreciation for their spouse. And so I'm just not sure how this all nets out, though. That's the big question.
I agree, and I think in the meantime there are plenty of frustrations, and I think that will contribute to people telling pollsters that they're worried about their marriage. I mean, people are worried about everything. They're worried about 4 more years of Trump. They're worried about 4 years of Biden. They're worried about, yeah. So anyhow, but I don't see that necessarily having any impact on their actual marital behavior.
But one thing that also I want to sort of mention here too is that I think you know, many scholars who've kind of been thinking and writing about marriage, you know, from Stephanie Coombs to Eli Finkel, have kind of been arguing that in the last century, but certainly in recent decades, that sort of the relative affluence, security, and stability of our societies have allowed couples to focus more on the expressive possibilities, you know, the individual possibilities of married life. And Finkel talks about it in terms of ascending, you know, Abraham Maslow's ladder. So you kind of, at the base are sort of basic concerns about safety and food, you know, financial well-being. And then in the middle are concerns about your kin and your kids. And then sort of at the top of this ladder are a desire to sort of express yourself, to be fulfilled and things like that. And so I think that there was this idea that we kind of would see marriage moving kind of in a more expressive and a more individualistic direction, kind of almost on a kind of relentless basis. But the question I have is, in a world where there's much more financial instability, where you recognize your kids' chances of making it in the world are much better if you can keep things together, where we're seeing more perhaps political instability, where you can't rely upon the government to do a good job of protecting you in terms of, in this case, a pandemic, perhaps people are going to be kind of climbing down Maslow's ladder a bit more and kind of recognizing that, hey, you know what? If I have a stable marriage or if I can rely upon my kin, it's going to be a lot easier to navigate this 21st century that's unfolding. So that's one thing I'm thinking about in terms of marriage, just the way in which the meaning of marriage may be changing and kind of implicitly as people come to realize that they can't really get to give them as much, stability and financial well-being as they have expected in the last few decades.
Marriage being a little bit more of a useful partnership than more like it used to be.
Partnership. Right,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thought, yeah.
I'm wondering if there's some class bias built into that. Are people who don't have college degrees that concerned with the expressive functions of marriage, of trying to express greater individualism in their marriages?
Well, Nick, that's a great question. And there's actually a former graduate student of mine, Jennifer Silva, is now a professor of sociology, and she's written about sort of this to some extent in 2 books. And I think she kind of thinks that and this actually corresponds in some ways too to what Kathy Eden wrote as well, right? That there's a certain way in which in Silva's work, working class couples and people, and in Eden's work, poor couples and women, in her case, have embraced this kind of more expressive view of marriage, and I don't think it's really served them well, and yet they don't have as much of the the economic resources to make that expressive model work as easily and as well.
So I definitely agree with you, and this is something we touched on in our book, that if you have the resources, the good job, the education, it provides a cushion for a more unstable normative framework to work. Sorry, I said that like an academic, but hopefully it was clear. Now, let me direct you to a finding that I've been thinking about recently. It was 20 years ago or more that Paul Amato showed that married couples spend far less time with each other and have more individualistic marriages than they used to, but yet were just as happy in their marriages. So in the data I analyzed for a chapter I keep referring to, I showed that marital quality declined a lot between maybe the late 70s and the mid-aughts, but since then has been rebounding. So I sort of took that to mean that marriages are starting to come to terms with the new normative terrain and terrain of expressiveness.
Nick, I think that's well, I would say a couple of things. That I would say, on the one hand, I think that contemporary couples, and including conservative and religious couples, have moved to expect husbands to do a lot more around the household, and that's a good thing, and makes it easier to juggle work and family in this contemporary world of ours. But in terms of kind of the expressive shift, I don't have, I can't point to a survey. It's just more kind of my sense of sort of how people are approaching married life, today in a more practical spirit.
Nick, I just want to make sure that we're still recording with your comings and goings.
We are, but I was actually just going to share a picture showing how much my internet sucks today.
Oh, we believe you.
No. I'm actually graphing it. Anyhow, yeah. So we are here now, and every time I'm here, we're recording, but we're gonna have some gaps to edit out.
Yeah. And then back to COVID. Everything bad that's happening is happening worse to people of lower income. So I would assume that relationships are worse among people of lower income. during that the way
Yeah,
COVID is
so,
affecting
right.
relationships is
Sure,
affecting.
sure. I'll have data on that just to confirm that. I think in the next week or so, but haven't yet cut that by cut the data by education income. But yeah, I think that's true. I think that financial stress is a major problem for a decent minority of couples right now, and so yeah, it's gonna vary by class. It's also the case too, though, that married Americans are more likely to be doing well psychologically and financially. We see, for instance, when it comes to sort of hunger or food insecurity, it's about twice as common among single parents as it is among married parents. When it comes to things like loneliness, we're seeing that only about 44% of married Americans are expressing some kind of loneliness, compared to 63% of single Americans. So those 2 points are kind of to this idea that marriage does provide some degree of economic and social security today amidst this pandemic.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I guess I would just say it doesn't necessarily have to be marriage. I think having a strong social structure, being in some kind of relationship, whether or not it's marriage, can provide many of those same things.
Right, what I think it's important to understand here is this. I mean, this is where the class divide, I think, is pretty important. We know, unfortunately, that well-educated Americans are more likely to be married, and they're more likely to be engaged in some kind of community or civic activity, some kind of network. And what that means is that there are plenty of single working class and poor Americans who don't have a spouse, and they don't have another kind of social anchor. And so this is linked to obviously things like the growth and deaths of despair in many working class communities in this country. So I don't think marriage is kind of like panacea, but the fact that marriage has been gutted in many poor working class communities, adds sort of considerable insult to injury in terms of people's ability to have meaningful social ties with others.
And parenthetically, just to elaborate on what you were saying, there's less participation in all sorts of civic and community forms of life that used to anchor us. Everything from attendance at a religious service to being part of a union to fraternal organizations, of all sorts of things.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, I made a big list here of all the possible ways that COVID can be affecting the family negatively. We talked about partnership bond, and the obvious financial ones, the potential homelessness for some people, the extreme of how this might be affecting families.
Yeah.
Difficulties interacting among families that are affected with the virus, how like physically they're able to relate to each other and the stress around that. Caretaking, if there's caretaking involved, that's a huge stressor. How do people distance within a home, especially within a small home? Death, just how grief affects family and relationships. The deficits in education that kids are experiencing now. So many things happening to kids, the kids being isolated, the mental health of children, the social growth of children, depression generally among everybody, no matter what class you are. Health habits, people eating differently and not exercising as well, and a lot more addiction. I understand there's a lot more overdosing going on now.
Yes.
And there already was a lot. Now there's even more.
I hear from Jessica, who is the clinical director at the suicide prevention hotline in Alameda County, that the number of calls they've gotten has gone up 50%.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
You're sorry, in which county is this, Nick?
Alameda County.
Okay.
Although, that's Berkeley, Oakland.
Okay.
But that, the hotline services a lot of other counties as well, I think, but primarily Alameda County.
Yeah. I heard a similar report from someone who is in sort of the psychological arena in a sort of rural Northern California as well. So that's one more sort of anecdotal piece of evidence on that score. And obviously the CDC just released data on young adults more generally, suggesting that young adults were considering suicide at much higher levels than they were, last year or the year before. So the lockdown has taken a huge, not just economic toll, but obviously social, emotional, educational toll on millions of Americans across the country.
Yeah, this is a fucking terrible time.
Well, I appreciated your optimistic view of relationships during this time.
Yeah, so and I think maybe we can close on this. I think that that in some ways it's the worst of times, but in some ways it's the best of times. So I think certainly in terms of just speaking personally for a second here, like I have never taken as many walks and hikes with my children as I have over the last 7 months. And I know that I'm not alone. I mean, I know that there are plenty of families out there that have done so much together and with their kids. And, I'm honestly grateful for, I've learned how to do a little bit of gardening. I've, learned how to do some mountain biking with my daughters. We've discovered some trails in the area we'd never gone down before. So there's all that stuff that's good and great. But there are many other things linked to this pandemic that are difficult and worse. So it's definitely a mixed bag in that sense in terms of how families in general and how our family has been affected by it.
It's certainly a golden age for dogs.
That's yes, people out and about with their
Well, everyone's always home.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
And pigs too, Nick.
I won't tell you the depressing.
Yeah.
I won't add more depressing stuff to it. Okay, now I have to. So people getting pets, thinking this is a great time to get a pet because you're home all the time, and then they start going back to work, and it turns out they can't take care of the pets, and end up bringing the pets back to the SPCA where they have difficulty finding homes for them. So a little depressing piece of news I heard recently.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there's a metaphor in there, but I can't find it. All right. I guess we will have to save the argument about the future of the GOP for another time.
Yeah, and there are others who are better prepared to weigh in on that one.
I mean, my response is I think back to that big feature the New York Times ran, maybe 10 years ago about, it was probably just with that title, The Future of the GOP. It was a long article about the Reformicons, most prominently like Ross Douthat and Riyam Salan, but a variety of others. And you were featured in that article, Brad. There were
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think there are ways in which I think Trump has pushed the Republican Party to revisit its commitment to low taxes and small government. And I think the challenge has been good, but I don't think we've seen any real good fruits yet from that challenge. And so the question is, will we see in 2024, any Republicans doing, much more to help ordinary families, navigate the challenges of childcare, education, work in meaningful ways. And Nick, I think, is obviously skeptical, and I'm hopeful that there are a few people out there who might, rise to the challenge in the next presidential cycle. So we'll see.
If nothing else, it's certainly true that unlike most other Republicans, Trump did not campaign on cutting Social Security and Medicare, and showed that there really isn't a big constituency for cutting Social Security and Medicare. I question the commitment to traditional Reaganite tax orthodoxy, since the first thing he did pretty much was cut taxes again for the wealthy.
Yeah, and I went after him in the Atlantic for that, and the Republican Party more generally,
Right.
in a piece. So again, I think there is right. Trump has helped a lot of thinkers in conservative circles re-examine their approach to economics, but we have not yet seen any real effect of that rethinking on the congressional agenda or sort of presidential policymaking.
I will agree with that. I will say, however, that there is, for Never Trump Republicans and for everyone else, a more successful model of how to be a center-right party, and that is in Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, and Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts. Blue states who nevertheless managed to have very popular Republican governors.
Yeah, I think that they have certainly governed well in the Maine and Maryland and Massachusetts, and there are some lessons for the national party there. But I think I would say that my view is that the standard bearer in 2024 should be kind of more explicitly focused on both talking about and delivering policies targeting marriage and family life, and we'll see if that hope is realized or not.
Right.
My headphones are starting to hurt my head.
That's always a good time to bring this to a close.
Okay, well, it's great to meet you over the internet.
Yeah,
and,
this was a great discussion. Yeah, we really learned a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Your time, and thanks, Nick, for doing this. And we'll look forward to getting this.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time, Brad. Say hi to Danielle for me, and I apologize for my crappy internet, and this will be out Monday.
Thanks for listening to The Professor and the Idiot. If you like what you heard, go to Apple Podcasts and give us a good rating. Your positive feedback completes us.